In Acts chapter 9, and you don't have to go there, I'll read it to you. In Acts chapter 9 and verse 1, it says, "But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues at Damascus, so that if he found anyone belonging to the way," and that was what early Christianity was called. It was called the way. He said if he found anyone who belonged to the way, men or women, he would bring them bound to Jerusalem. This way he went to the high priest. He's so zealous for his Judaism. He's so zealous against Christ that he goes and he says, "I want permission to be the one who goes after them. I want permission to be the one who literally goes and binds them to bring them back." What would he be bringing them back for? Execution or recanting. You come back to Jerusalem and you either recant Christ or you, just like Stephen. Give me letters to go after them. The question comes, it came to me while I was studying. Who is Paul to make that request? Have you ever thought about that question? Have you ever thought about, here Paul in Acts chapter 9, he goes and makes a request of the Sanhedrin, give me letters to go and be basically the Jewish policeman? The Hebrew lawmaker? Who is he to make that request? I'm glad you asked. Back in Philippians, you remember he said, as to the law, he was a what? Starts with a P. He was a Pharisee. And he was not just any Pharisee. Paul was a brilliant, young Pharisee, personally trained by one of the greatest teachers of Hebrew law, a man by the name of Gamaliel. And if you want a reference for that, it's in Acts chapter 22, verse 3. According to Smith's Bible Dictionary, Paul is generally identified with the very celebrated Jewish doctor Gamaliel, grandson of Hillel, and who is referred to as an authority in the Jewish Mishnah, the Jewish law. Paul got a first-rate Jewish seminary education from the greatest teacher alive in his day. The grandson of the great Hillel. Hillel had the Hillelian school. And Paul sat at his feet. And you know how they used to train? They would have to memorize and interpret Scripture, and then the teacher would sit with his students at his feet, and he would literally, one at a time, point at you and ask you a question. Ask you a question. That's how it was done by rote. It was done by memorization. This was what Paul would have had. Now, early on, he would have studied with his father, learning to be a leather worker, a tent maker, common occupation in Tarshish where he was born. But at age 13, tradition says, is when he would have went to study with Gamaliel. So from age 13 on, to the time of his conversion, he was a student. MacArthur notes that the kind of instruction Paul would have received is a combination of memorizing, interpreting Scripture, and that Saul would have memorized and learned to interpret Scripture according to the rabbinical tradition, notably that of the Talmud. He was not only getting the Scriptures pushed into his head and memorizing them, but he was also getting the traditions, the Talmud, the traditions of the rabbis. All of this he was getting day after day after day. So Paul is this young, bright Pharisee who is zealous for his law. And he would have been known by the religious elite. And when he began to persecute, those of the way, the Christians, he went for sanction. Give me the power. And they gave him the power. And you know, if the story had ended there, Paul would have probably been one of the worst, or if not the worst, persecutor in the history of the church. If the story would have just ended there, that would have been it. And all we'd ever talk about was how bad Paul was. And how he was like any of the rest of those who persecuted Christians, Nero or anyone else from the first century that we could point to. But we all know that's not how the story ends. God had a different direction. And this I do want you to see. It's in Acts chapter 9. It's the story of Paul's conversion. Acts 9 and verse 3. It says, "Now as he went on his way, he approached Damascus. And suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him." Now later on in the book of Acts, he would tell the story and say that this actually happened around noontime. So you can imagine how bright the light would have had to have been to bleach out even the light of the sun at noontime in Israel. It says, the light flashed around him, and falling to the ground, he heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul." Jesus has a way of doing that. When He's getting people's attention, saying the name more than once. Peter, Peter. Saul, Saul. Why are you persecuting me? Notice there Christ designates Himself with His body, the church. Paul never met Jesus that we know of. Paul never persecuted Jesus physically that we know of. But Paul persecuted the church. And Jesus said, "Why are you persecuting me? My body." And he said, "Who are you, Lord?" To call Him Lord. And he said, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you will be told what you are to do." And the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one. Saul rose from the ground, and although his eyes were open, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him into Damascus. I want you to imagine that scene for just a moment. Here is a man who is at the same time terrified and shattered. He's terrified because a light from heaven is now encompassing him. And as we know from other places in Scripture, when God's presence is with a person, it's not like you see on Touched by an Angel. It's not a heavenly glow and everybody feels all warm and fuzzy inside. When God's presence is with a person, it is frightening. Isaiah 6. I put my hand over my mouth and I said, "Woe is me, for I am undone. I am a man of unclean lips, and I live amongst the people of unclean lips. Woe is me." That's the presence of God. Frightened, but also shattered. Because he thought he was doing right. Everything he had been doing up to that point, all that zeal, was pointed in the wrong direction. Yeah, you can imagine that. Imagine his devastation. This Jesus, who his fellow Israelites had ridiculed, beaten, put to death. The Jesus whom Stephen had called as Saul stood consenting to his death. The Jesus whose followers Saul himself had been imprisoning and seeking their execution. This Jesus was God, just as he had claimed to be, and now Paul stood exposed and helpless and ashamed and broken. And blinded by His majesty.